adequate aggregate demand. The demand for goods was insufficient. One of the reasons that it was insufficient to generate jobs for all the people in the economy, or would have been, had we not taken certain actions. The reason for the weakness in the economy are many, but one of them is the growing inequality that was alluded to before. The magnitude of this growth in inequality is really big striking. Sometimes people say that watching inequality, changes in inequality, is like watching grass grow. It happens very slowly, but after a while, you can see something's happened. And that's true in the United States. Today, in the United States, the upper 1% gets about a quarter of all the income in the United States and controls of roughly 40% of all the wealth. Well, why is this an economic problem? It may be a problem for social justice, but it's also an economic problem because that kind of redistribution is shifting money away from people who would have spent it to people who don't spend all of it. They still spend some of it, but they don't spend all of it. And the result of that is there's a weakness in aggregate demand. There are some other problems. One of them, again, that Ed referred to. We are addicted to oil, to imported oil. And then beginning in 2003, with the war in Iraq, the price of oil per barrel went from $23 a barrel to over $140 a barrel. What did that mean? That meant money that would have been spent on goods in the United States got spent in importing goods from, importing oil from elsewhere. So again, whatever your views about global warming, this was an economic problem as well as an environmental problem. Well, these and some other factors led to a weakness in our economy that was compensated for in a very simple way. Loose monetary policy and lax regulation. So loose monetary policy and lax regulation created a bubble. We could feel good about what was going on. And as the bubble grew, people could spend more. They could consume. In 1 year alone, America took almost $1 trillion, over $900 billion out of their houses in mortgage equity withdrawals, money that they could spend, that could keep the economy going. In a way, the answer in the United States to this growing inequality, when I say growing inequality, what I want to make sure, it's not that there was trickle-down economics, that those at the top were benefiting, that the rising tide lifts all boats, everybody was better off. Most Americans today are worse off than they were 12 years ago. Median income, median people half above, half below, is lower today than it was in 1997, adjusted for inflation. So what we said with their income going down, what we said that people didn't want to have a lowering of their standard of living, we came up with a brilliant solution to this problem. We said, borrow. And Americans were very good at that. Ed has described all the problems. One of the things that we're really good at is borrowing. And our financial system was enthusiastic because they made a lot of money out of this. So the standards of living could continue, consumption could continue, could increase, and incomes could go down. But actually, people could feel good about themselves because their balance sheet looked good. Their wealth was going up because of the bubble prices on their housing. But it was all a dream. It wasn't reality because what was the value of their houses were artificial. It should have been clear that what was going on in the United States was not sustainable. This kind of debt was not sustainable. Savings rates in the United States, average savings rate, household personal savings rate, went down to 0. And if that's the average, that meant a lot of people were saving negatively. That is borrowing. I say it wasn't sustainable. And one of my predecessors as chairman of the Council of Economics Advisory once put it, that which is not sustainable won't be sustained. And so it wasn't. What happened was inevitable. And with the breaking of the bubble, explosive demand declined. Just wasn't there. And that is the story of the recession in a nutshell. But it's only part of the story because when asked, what I describe in my book is like, the problem is like peeling back the onion. Every time you have an explanation, you have to ask, well, why was that? As I said before, markets aren't supposed to work that way. Why were the banks making these bad loans? Why were they engaged in these kinds of lending practices? Well, the easy answer is bad incentives. Those in the financial sector had incentives to engage in excessive risk-taking, short-sighted behavior. It was really quite striking when Alan Greenspan was called to testify before the Congress. He gave this speech where this testimony, where widely interpreted as mea culpa. And he said, I'm sorry, I thought the bank managers would do a better job of managing their risk. Well, I was surprised that he was surprised. Because looking at their incentive structure, you would have predicted that they would have engaged in this excessive risk-taking. The economists disagree on a lot of things, but the one thing the economists tend to agree on is that incentives matter. If they had not engaged in the risk-taking, we would have had to rewrite our textbooks. So the good news for economists is that we don't have to rewrite our textbooks. Incentives do matter. The bad news is for the country. So they engaged in, as I say, this excessive risk-taking. But again, you have to peel back the onion. You have to ask the question, why was that? Why did they have flawed incentive structures? Because markets are, one of the things that we pride our markets in is creating good incentive structures. Why didn't they do that? Well, that's again a long story that I can't go into, but the short answer goes back to some of the things in economics information that I've worked on. It goes back to what we call agency issues, corporate governance, the incentives of the managers who were making the decisions and shaping the incentive structures were not aligned with shareholders, bondholders, or the rest of our society. So there was an incentive problem in the design of incentives. And that really gets you to a very profound problems of how do we deal with it. Well, I could go down and talk a little bit more about the other factors that were to blame, but I want to go talk a little bit more about why the responses didn't work and where we are. But there's one thing I do need to talk about, something that is not to blame, that's gotten a lot of discussion. What was the role of government? Well, government did fail. It failed in inadequate regulation. We've had financial crises over and over again in the history of capitalism. They happen with some degree of regularity. There's only been about a 35-year period in which we did not have financial crises. And that was a period after the Great Depression when we adopted laws like Glass-Steagall to regulate the financial sector. And they worked. They worked actually remarkably well. And because they worked, we didn't have crises. But then, too many people made the wrong inference. They said, well, because we don't have any crises, we don't need regulation. So they stripped away the regulation. And guess what? In the 30 years after they stripped away the regulation, the world's had over 100 crises. We just did it bigger and better than anybody else. But we even had one of our minor crises, the S&L crisis, in the 1980s. So once deregulation set in, we went back to the old world of repeated crisis. And that was a major mistake on government, that it allowed this deregulation to occur. But there's another source of blame that on government sometimes put, that it was government's attempt to encourage housing for poor people that is the source of the blame. Let me make it clear. There are many countries around the world where you have well-regulated financial markets, good government programs, sometimes assisting this,